Greetings, everybody. Welcome once again to our webinar or podcast, however you choose to consume these tidbits of our regular deep dive into the wonderful, some would say weird, world of strata and management rights. I think we would say weird management rights in Queensland. So I am Chris Irons, Director of StrataSolve. That's stratasolve.com.au. As always, alongside of me is Frank Higginson, partner at Hynes Legal, which is the premier provider of legal services to the strata industry in Queensland. Hello, Frank.
Hello, Chris. Hello, everyone.
What's going on with you, Frank?
Mate, it's the same. I think it really is. It's still a little bit relentless in terms of the level of inquiry and activity, but I don't know. It's still trying to get used to people. It's impossible. I just can't explain why some people ask the questions they do or do the things they do, and I can't help clients understand when they ask me why are they doing this. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's we try to explore it sometimes in these things, but I wish I had a magic wand sometimes, mate.
Don't we all? Strata magic wand. Look, just a little bit of housekeeping as per always. If you're listening in live via YouTube, you can post your questions in the chat function. We welcome those questions. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can. For those listening in later on while you're out walking the dog or doing the dishes or whatever, you can find all the notes and links we refer to today in www.hyneslegal.com.au. This week we're going to try something just a tad different, and we think probably a bit of a series, the first in a bit of a series. So every week, Frank, we talk about your scheme, your body corporate, your building, but each building is different, isn't it?
It is. And I suppose, mate, this is our show. We can do what we want with it. So go out on a limb, but you're right, and starting with sort of the style of building. And I suppose one of the difficulties with strata always is the style of a building depends on who owns the lots in it over time. And that can absolutely change. And it really does happen with economic cycles. I go back to, make myself feel old here, sound old, but 2000 when GST arrived. At that stage, John Howard was in power, panic about affordability of housing. Like, how many times have we heard that over the last couple of decades? And it was all about how young people might be locked out of the housing market because GST was going to increase prices on end products and blah, 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 blah. So we had the first home owners boost, $7,000. That appeared, and that was one of the transitional things for GST. So suddenly we had a whole bunch of young people getting their $7,000, buying units in a market that obviously was 20 years ago from today, so a lot lesser expensive, and was changing the demographics of buildings because a lot of the buildings they were buying were short-term holiday let ones that might have been one bedders. You can pick up a unit for 190 and get 7 from the government and a discount for stamp duty, and away you go. So where am I going with that? Buildings can change, but we'll talk a little bit about that today. But there are certainly some buildings that are short stay in nature.
So yeah, we're going to kick off a series looking at different types of buildings. And as you said, Frank, this week we're going to kick it off with trying to profile your building if it is largely a short-term let accommodation building. So future editions, we will look at buildings which are mostly owner-occupier in some case, and then we'll also do the mix situation. We'll look at buildings which are commercial in nature and a few other variations on that theme. The reason why we're doing that for several reasons. You'll see the differences emerge as we talk about them. But I'm a big believer, and I'm pretty sure you are too, Frank. You've got to know who and what it is you're dealing with in order to be able to get the result that you want. And the fundamental that you need to know is what kind of building, what kind of profile do you have that you are dealing with, because each one, as you just said, Frank, will pose different challenges for you, regardless of role. To suppliers, occupier, manager, caretaker, different buildings mean different things. Let's rip into it. Sorry, I'm just having going a bit wobbly there. No, I'm okay. All right, so short-term letting buildings, what are they like? Well, obviously, let's define our terms first of all. So we're talking here, Frank, mostly short-term let, and that means whether or not it's short-term let through an on-site manager or a platform like Airbnb.
Yeah, and there's some off-site managers as well that operate these things and sort of aggregate things. And there's some people that go around and lease back units and put them through Airbnbs and that sort of thing. So but by and large, I think you'd probably say most short stay buildings have management rights in them as a whole. So usually there's an on-site manager, but obviously it's lots of people, by its vary by what we're talking about, come and go on shorter notice, aren't permanent occupants.
That's right. And I think distinct from, say, longer term tenancies, which would be its own webinar again. So I think, and if you want to get really drilled down into definitions, I think long-term tenancies, that's pretty much 6 months or more. We're talking here probably even less than 6 months, probably more like 3 months or less in most cases. Would you agree, Frank?
Yeah, 3 months seems to be the magic word in terms of when something becomes permanent, but weeks at a time probably.
So what does the short-term building look like? A short-term let building look like? Well, I guess the obvious thing is people are frequently coming and going. That's probably one of the first things. Yep. There's a high volume of traffic from, say, interstate or overseas. That's another feature. Then there are specific kind of physical features. So reception area, check-in desk would be one of them. A tour desk. Swimming pools, but particular kinds maybe of swimming pools, Frank. So like resort structured kind of pools. Things like a spa and a gym would be reasonably common. Perhaps an on-site restaurant, cafe or bar would be another. Yep. Some pretty extensive gardens or landscaping. And a fair whack of, say, visitor underground parking as well. Yeah.
And it might even be the parking's not allocated. I think you do sometimes see buildings that are predominantly short stay where the sort of parking's a bit of a first come, first served, not allocated to particular units.
Yeah. One of the other features of a short-term let building, see if you agree with me on this one, Frank, people are not there for a long time, they're there for a good time.
Yes. Absolutely. What do you do on holidays? You tend to have a couple of drinks, you sit around on balconies, you enjoy the view. You're not certainly preparing to go to work the next day at 7 o'clock in the morning and deal with whatever pain that your daily existence comes with, which creates a bit more of a relaxed environment.
I think that's it. And again, we're trying not to be too absolute with these profiles because there's always variances, but that's generally it. The attitude of the people largely residing there is more relaxed, more transient rather than relaxed, maybe. And of course, the other feature, probably one of the main ones, there's going to be an on-site manager, caretaker, letting agent. So that means it's got to be the accommodation module, doesn't it, Frank?
No. And I suppose this is all part of the law reform working group again that we're working through at the moment. So I would say, though, that where the lots are predominantly accommodation lots, and that's lots that are available for rent on a short or long-term basis, the building can be in the accommodation module, but it doesn't mean it has to be. There's definitely, I know there's a raft of these at the Esplanade at Burleigh, buildings that are predominantly short stay accommodation. There's some lovely complexes down there. A lot of those are in the accommodation module are in the standard module for whatever reason. So don't have to be, can be. And of course, the big difference between standard and accommodation modules for management rights purposes is the maximum length of term of the management rights agreement. So under a standard module, you're capped at 10 years, and under the accommodation module, you can be 25. And I suppose there's probably not, over the decades, and it is the decades now, the modules have become a little bit more homogenous between standard and accommodation. That's probably the big difference between the two.
Yeah. It's important for people to realise that selection of accommodation module, there's no active vetting of that sort of thing. So it's not as though the module is selected and then goes to the registrar of titles and somebody looks at it and say, hang on, that building doesn't seem like it should have that kind of module. You need to either change it or show cause. That doesn't happen, does it?
No. The titles office, or DERM, was it Department of Environment, Resources and Mines, whatever it is now, that registers these things, dead set, when they get a CMS, they're looking for a legible seal, plans in accordance with the practice directions, and the fees being paid.
That's it.
That's it. They don't care. So you can put bylaws in there, amongst other things, whatever bylaw you want, they'll register it. They don't test it.
There are many people who think that that should change. There should be some much more active vetting of those kind of essential features. That remains to be seen if that will happen, but it's definitely out there as on the agenda. All right, so look, let's delve then, Frank. What would you say works really well about a short-term let building, a largely short-term let building?
Tourism. Tourism and Queensland, one of Queensland's biggest industries is tourism. And so you go to the high rises you see on the Gold Coast, Sunny Coast, Port Douglas is basically 100% management rights, short stay accommodation. So holiday, definitely. But you also see corporate, a lot of the big corporate buildings in the city owned by the bigger players in terms of a management rights sense, corporate, and students, one of the left field ones. So those tend to congregate around universities and might have a different structure of unit where you might have the sort of a common room which has 3 bedrooms. So 3 students can share the one room and the one facility, and there's other facilities on top of that. So that'd be the big 3.
Right. Okay.
So it's an interesting setup, some of those student ones.
And what else, Frank? Tell us what else is usually a pro.
Well, they've probably got some specific common facilities, and particularly, I mean, let's stay for a moment. If you're in a corporate building, you've probably got a corporate short stay building. You've probably got the typical gym, running machines, whatever it might be. I don't know, every hotel I go to has those. I don't tend to stay in too many management rights that are short stay, not that I do any running. But from a holiday or leisure perspective is probably the other way to put it. Facilities that are built towards that. So things you might do on holidays that you might not do if you're more permanent occupier and that sort of stuff. And I suppose the presentation, because star ratings and reviews and all that sort of stuff become important for any short stay building, any brand. So making sure that whatever you've got presents relatively well. So in a building that might be largely owner occupied, you don't really care as much about external reviews. If you're an owner of a lot in a short stay building, or particularly if you're a manager who's running a letting operation in one, those reviews can make or break your business. So making sure that people walk away happy from a service perspective and from a presentation perspective becomes pretty important.
Yeah. So, and that's not to say that those features are not important in other buildings. Of course they are. They're just probably more critical, I guess, in a short-term let building. What about expectations around management, Frank?
I think they're brutally important in these things. And I know I got a favourite story I've told, man. Probably I would have told it during these webinar series, but I'll do it again for those that haven't heard it. Had a client probably in the mid 2000s, schoolies on the Gold Coast. So I suppose peak schoolies, and some buildings were no schoolies and some buildings were schoolies. And I said to him, "How do you go with these kids?" Because at that stage we were in an office in Surfers Paradise, and we'd see them climb in from balcony to balcony. It's just terrifying. Which is a fraction unruly. He said, "Frank, it's easy." He said, when I take the booking, I tell them the rules, I give it to them in writing, and on the first night, the first person to break the rules gets evicted. Because that's a really big difference between long-term tenants, which you've got an exclusive right to possession under a lease, and a short stay accommodation, which is really under a license. So that can be brought to an end. So my client said, and then all the kids talk to the other kids, and they all know that the people in Unit 304, because they tend to come from the same school groups or whatever, got evicted. And from that point forward, it's wonderful.
The old decimation tactic that used to be used in the Roman Empire.
1 in 10, isn't it? Off the balcony you go, my friend. So from his perspective, that was the way to deal with it. So that's managing expectations, and that is the joy of what a good on-site manager will bring. Because if you've got a building of 40 units managed through 40 different property agents, through 40 different platforms, or even the Airbnbs or whatever, where there's actually no one there, and someone does the wrong thing, how do you deal with it? So you don't. So that was that expectation management, and you'll see it around schoolies particularly, but also it applies across the board. You go to some buildings, we've got no party policy. So if you're partying after 10 o'clock at night, then you be ready to get evicted. So a good on-site manager in a short stay building will make sure that happens. And I think that's a real big part of the value that they can bring to a building, full stop.
And it occurs to me, Frank, that very closely related to that, those people would in turn possibly have some really strong networks and links with people in the local community where it would actually be a benefit. So they might actually know local police quite well, local liquor records quite well, be engaged in those kind of on the ground activities, which then contribute to things actually working out far more smoothly anyway.
Yep. Absolutely. It is. It's just, let run wild. People can misbehave. Expectation management and then enforcement of those rules, like anything, you come back to it. We learn life lessons in kindergartens. Play nicely, share your toys, don't call other kids names. If we all did that for all of our lives, we'd be fine. This is just an extension of it and probably includes alcohol.
It always does, doesn't it?
Yes.
Couple of the other sort of like key positives, key sort of really good points about the short-term let accommodation building. Generally speaking, you will find that they're in a strategically pretty good physical location. So right in the thick of things, which in turn means that they'll be pretty well accessible to public transport as well. So some of those kind of, again, some of those broader links you would find, because there's a high volume of people coming in and out, you would find that they would be well serviced or generally well serviced by those kinds of facilities. And I guess this ties into the point you were making earlier as well, Frank. Those kinds of buildings become quite well known over a period of time. You can rattle off the name of short-term let accommodation building, and chances are people will have heard of it. Oh, I know that building. It's blah, blah, or blah, blah. That isn't something that you would find with a lot of other buildings. And that, of course, can add to property values.
And if nothing else, your income return in the meantime, because you've got a brand that you're selling. Like people who don't live in their units are renting them out for the purposes of deriving a proper income. The better the brand, better the income, away you go.
Absolutely. Those are the good things, but of course, if there are good things, there must be pitfalls as well, Frank. What are some of the pitfalls of a short-term let building?
People, I suppose the starting point is that whoever's the guests usually aren't as invested in the maintenance and care of the common property that owner-occupiers might be. I can jam things into walls and I don't care. I'm going to throw stuff off balconies. If I'm getting drunk, I'm going to Yahoo. You certainly don't create in a short stay building the sense of community that you can get in long stay buildings. And that is across both owners and tenants when it happens. So, that the care factor can really be limited is probably the thing that flows from that. And mate, as you and I both know, bylaw enforcement's difficult at the best of times. It is almost impossible in a short stay building to actually do anything legal. I spoke before about my client removing those particular schoolies. That's because he was the agent for the owner, and he had let those people into the property by virtue of a license agreement, which is what the right to occupy was in terms of they're paying the tariff for the week. So he removed them as a landlord, not as a body corporate. So from a body corporate perspective, enforcing bylaws against a short stay tenant, unfortunately, is next to impossible.
Yeah. And then that in turn, because of that challenge, leads to a lot of practical issues. Things about obviously noise, parking, big issue, smoking, general antisocial behaviour. I mean, those are things which bylaws and nuisance can regulate to some extent, but when there's a challenge in actually enforcing bylaw and nuisance, well, it's very difficult, if well, it's impossible to regulate. I guess one of the big factors, Frank, is that the interests of those people who happen to live there a lot more long term are not the same as those.
Absolutely. And this has been an issue since Barabbas was playing fullback for Jerusalem in Strata. And I don't, short of there being a specific zoning, which is short stay only or long stay only, and there's issues with this, I know, up in North Queensland, same as there is on the Gold Coast, that expectations, people buy a unit, they want to live in it, but it might be that they're the only permanent occupant in a building of 50 short stay lots. That is ground zero for conflict in Strata.
Yeah.
Always has been, and it's really hard to retrospectively change planning approvals without disenfranchising someone.
Absolutely. because of those sort of stark differences in motivations, you then get a situation where that gets played out at committee level. So you might have committee interests which are equally strongly divided in that case.
And you tend to find the owner-occupiers are the ones that tend to put their hand up on committee because the investors might be in Victoria or whatever it might be and don't want to get as involved.
Absolutely. And I guess then that then flows to issues in relation to the on-site manager. So the relationships are different in that case, aren't they? They can be, Frank, can't they?
Yep, yeah. Absolutely. Because, you know, at its core, what an owner-occupier is doing is removing a short-term rental from, or potential rental from the manager's rental pool. So that relationship might not be as friendly as otherwise could be from time to time. So I think, like again, I still get dirty when we don't get all the jobs that I pitch for. I'm learning to get over it, but it's still, I'm the best person for that job and away we go. Resident managers need to have that same mindset because you're never going to win everything and people are going to live in units that you could otherwise rent. But making those people your enemy is not necessarily the smartest thing to do. That sometimes happens.
A couple of other pitfalls to look out for. So there is some potential for the levies to generally be a bit higher because of all those common property features we mentioned earlier. Not always, and indeed some permanent sort of owner-occupier buildings, they can have equally, if not higher, standard of common property as well. But generally speaking, I think we're talking there. And in the same way that we spoke before about a short-term let building having a really good reputation simply by virtue of its name and its location, the absolute flip side of that, of course, is that you can very quickly get a negative reputation if things don't go according to plan. So if a building becomes known as a party building, and there are some particularly sort of bad things which occur at that building, very quickly can get a negative reputation, can't it, Frank?
That's where Current Affair and the Gold Coast Bulletin come to the fore, you know, or whatever it might be. So, and that's not helpful for property values or income returns or any of that sort of stuff. So, I mean, you know, still extraordinary the things that people do in, you know, some people's behaviour is still extraordinary, and short-term occupancy gives them the ability to behave in ways that they wouldn't do in their own home.
Also gives them the ability to immediately hop on Google and write a ridiculous review based upon an unrealistic expectation, and the whole building gets tarnished that way.
Yes.
So, as always, we kind of like to title together with best practice, and I suppose we're framing our best practice in this series about, well, how do you make it work for you? There's some pros, there's some cons. Regardless of whether you're the committee, owner, occupier, caretaker, strata manager, or someone else connected to the building, how can you actually make this situation, this imperfect, they're all imperfect, how do you make these particular imperfect situations work for you? I guess I start always, the cynic in me, I guess, thinks that every strata situation always comes back to the hip pocket. It has to. So therefore, if there's a problem, engage with that hip pocket motivation. So the problem is X. X is a problem because it has a detriment to your property values. That's why we need to address it. That kind of really basic equation.
Money talks. Always.
Yeah.
The next thing, I suppose, that happens in probably largely short stay buildings because they're not owner occupiers is getting owner engagement is really difficult. So we've now got the ability to do electronic voting. So suddenly Strata's moved into the 20th century in the context of I tick boxes and send stuff back. So I suppose if you are largely short-term orientated or short stay orientated or non-owner occupied, making sure that your body corporate, I suppose if this is a question, if you want to have owners engaged, making sure that your body corporate has adopted electronic voting is a great way to do that. Because if you don't do that, you're back to the old school, fill in the paper, go to the post office, post it back, all that sort of stuff, which for most people is too hard.
It is. The next point, in strata relationships are pretty much everything, but I think especially so in the short-term let buildings because you've got the critical role that the on-site manager plays in those buildings. So you have to, that just gets added to the mix in that situation. So, and it's an old thing that I know I say all the time, you don't have to be friends with people in strata. You don't need to be besties. In fact, you probably shouldn't be, ideally. but you do need to figure out the right working relationship to make that work for you.
Yep, it's a business. Treat it like one.
Yep. What else have we got there, Frank?
Well, mate, and I suppose ultimately then it's back to the committee. You know, again, committee's got an obligation to act reasonably. What that means, it can be a very subjective thing. And so I think from a committee perspective, and again, subject to where you've got that balance, it might be all investor owners, all in a completely 100% short stay building where there's no owner occupiers, happy days, your interests are completely aligned. Where you've got a committee that might have that separation of interest, some owner occupiers and some investors, it's really important to try to stay above that personal attachment to whatever your style of occupation actually is. I mean, we're back to, again, mate, treating the body corporate as a business. We've got business decisions to make in relation to what this thing is. And if you're, and this is one of the things that happens, you know, occasionally, if you're trying to change the status quo, so if you've bought into a building that is largely short stay and you want it to become owner occupied and make your life easier and you're the substantial minority, then that is going to be fights the whole way. So like part of it for me is that the right building for you to be living in? And that's not to say, again, not necessarily a pro or anti-management rights stance. That is just a recipe for disaster if you're trying to change the way something has been for an extended period of time.
Absolutely, Frank. Yeah. Another point, and this is more an awareness, keeping in mind kind of point, that a short-term let building you might find in Queensland in particular, commonly in a coastal area. And then when it is in a coastal area, it's exposed to higher risks in relation to weather events. So cyclones, floods, but also concrete cancer, so that long-term damage which might come from being exposed to sea air. So that is not something that you would be facing if you were living in, say, a 10-lot scheme in the suburbs, or not maybe to the same extent. One other thing which occurs to me, Frank, to sort of keep in mind with a short-term let building as we've been talking, yeah, and it goes back to what you were saying before about the building might be quite prominent and be prominently located in a geographical region. If things go wrong in relation to that building, there does open up then the prospect of being able to engage with government and being able to engage with government to say, well, look, this is a prominent building in a prominent area which supports tourism. Tourism means a lot to our economy. We're experiencing these issues which we can't get past. So entreaty to the government to think not just as a strata issue, but as a more community-based, tourism-based issue. So I guess what I'm trying to say there, Frank, I think there is the ability in a short-term let building to think a bit more laterally.
Yes, completely agree. And I mean, I think short-term accommodation is going to become more and more important as we power towards the Olympics. You know, that's a decade away, but it's not. The way we're moving today, it'll be a year and a heartbeat. It's
definitely on the agenda of government in Queensland. Let's put it that way. We wait and see. So look, I hope you got something out of that one, whether you reside in or own in or work with a primarily short-term let building. We think it's just about being aware of what you're dealing with. If you have that increased awareness, you're generally speaking on a much better footing to be able to manage things, to sort of work your way through the issues.
Absolutely.
Stay tuned for the rest of the series. There are plenty of different kinds of buildings, so there will be plenty of different kinds of webinars. That's all we have time for this week, though. As we mentioned before, you can find all the notes and all the links, and there's some pretty good information at those links at hyneslegal.com.au. You can find me at stratasolve.com.au, and you can find Frank at hyneslegal.com.au. We have one very last minute question though, from John. John, thanks. I have a building that has a bylaw stating no leases less than 3 months, so no short term. How easy is it to change this? Is the legal bylaw, and what are the common pitfalls in going down the road of changing this? I can answer that pretty simply, John. That's probably very much an invalid bylaw. Frank?
There's nothing probable about it. Section 180 sub 3 of the BCCM Act, mate. So the bylaws can't restrict the type of residential use to which a unit's put. That has been held. Residential use is both short and long term. So invalid.
With one tiny exception.
As
Frank,
long as you're not under the Building Units Group Titles Act, you're okay. But I do know John, I'm pretty sure he's not. So, mate, no, bylaw's invalid. In theory, you can do it. To me, then it's a planning question. And it's also a management of a community expectation. Because for me, it's the same shoes on the other foot there. If you're trying to bring short-term letting into a building that has long-term occupants, that is also potentially fraught with danger. So be careful.
Good question, John. Thank you for that. That's all we have time for today. Thanks again, everyone. Frank, thank you as always. And again, thanks everyone for taking the time to listen in. Let's do it all again.
Done. See you next week, everyone.
Farewell.
Bye.